The mainstream media and the prejudice of lesser expectations. That is the topic of tonight's Byline. I want to start with a bit of a personal story. So the morning after Rob Ford was elected mayor of Toronto in October 2010, I was walking around in the Annex neighborhood and I ran into this woman I know. "Isn't it just awful?" she exclaimed to me. Now I knew right away what she was getting at. Now, while I hadn't supported Ford for mayor in my columns at the time, I certainly didn't think the sky was falling, and I told her so. "But isn't it a shame," she added, "that he's so racist?" Well, I don't know about that, I said. "It seems like he has a diverse group of supporters and campaign workers." So my well-intentioned friend, she nodded, more to herself. Yes, it's too bad they don't know what's best for them. Bam. I've never forgotten that encounter because of what it signifies, folks. While the concept of the prejudice of lesser expectations wasn't exactly new to me, I've certainly seen more of it around since then. Now, perhaps I just wasn't attuned to it before, because it seems many people today still don't pick up on it at all. Otherwise, there would be outrage. That's right, outrage over a Toronto Star story from last weekend. Headlined, "Low-Income Supporters Stand by Their Mayor," the feature examines the mentality of Ford Nation supporters in the low-income, high-visible minority neighborhood of Rexdale. For the longest time, the party line was that Ford's mayoralty was the personification of an urban downtown versus suburban war. Polite society, they loved this argument because trashing suburbanites is easy. It's low-hanging fruit. The idea was pretty much that Mike Harris, former Ontario Premier, he used amalgamation to put trendy downtown Toronto at the mercy of suburban white people who live in McMansions, they drive SUVs and shop in big box stores. Ugh, such a soulless demographic can surely be trashed with impunity. Hey, folks? Well, hang on, though. A spanner was thrown in the works by John Wright. He's the Senior Vice President at Ipsos Public Affairs, well-respected man. In a November 20th story in The Star, the pollster explained that Ford's current support, well, it's not actually that high in the suburbs, especially in his home base of Etobicoke. In fact, location isn't the biggest particular in Ford support. Income and education play a greater role. Quoting The Star, some 44% of respondents who don't have a high school diploma support Ford, while only 17% of those with university degrees do. People who make less than $40,000 per year are twice as likely to be part of Ford Nation than those who make $100,000 or more. Which brings us to the original December 6th story attempting to make sense of this. The reporter interviews several Rexdale Ford supporters. Alongside their quotes, information is presented undermining their support. Ford's policies don't benefit low-income people, it's claimed. Ford votes against social programs that would help them in their situation, it's countered. And the kicker, always the kicker, Ford has allegedly made some recent racist gaffes. This article, folks, it oozes with condescension. To me, the subtext reads as, "So what's the deal with all the stupid poor people? And how can we, the enlightened ones, how can we correct their backwards ways?" A July Toronto Life article came to the same conclusion as Mr. Wright. The most popular online comments, though, were from Jay, who criticized the poor, uneducated people who have no clue what goes on in the world, too stupid to realize. He writes that Ford is bad for them. And then online user Lev, his assertion was popular that, like in the US, these idiots vote against their own best interests. That's right. People in the suburbs, low-income people, low-educated people, don't know what's good for them, according to users like Lev and Jay. Folks, this is not about Toronto. This is not about Rob Ford. This is a much bigger story than that. This is about how supposed progressives have a deep disdain for democracy when people don't think just like them. And that's the Byline. Ray Hurd joins me now, Sun News contributor. Ray, I wanted you to join me for reaction on this story because you've got a wealth of experience in newsrooms and newspapers, in television stations. What's your initial reaction to the story? It seems to me like mass editorializing.
Yes, it is, but you must understand that the Toronto Star is guided by the Atkinson principles. It claims to be egalitarian or populist or grassroots, But the people who write for it, and I was one once, and I was guilty.
I've written for it a few times myself back in the day.
Tend to be kind of elitist, intellectual elitists who define what I call the culture of entitlement for everyone else. So if you don't agree with their editorial line, which is left of center, they have some good people. The irony is the two guys who run it are protégés of Conrad Black and David Radler, who are way to the right on the issues, but as publisher and as the editor, they know where their bread is buttered, and it lies in an intellectual elitism which borders, in the case of the Globe and Mail too often, on intellectual fascism, because they know better what's good for you. And the irony, Anthony, the compelling irony here, is a very simple one. Rob Ford's policies are designed and have succeeded to a degree, although I didn't vote for him, in wiping out the gravy train and waste overspending. He is a great and successful critic. And guess who the main beneficiaries of that policy are? Are the poorer class of Canadians, people who live in areas like Rexdale. They benefit when the gravy is cut out, because people who live where I live in Rosedale, they don't care what things cost. They can afford almost anything they want.
But whether that's true or not, in the Star feature, they go to great lengths to say to these people that Ford's measures to cut the gravy train are hurting them. Thus, these people, the implication to me, the subtext, not smart enough to know what their own interests are.
But that's not fact-based, because if Rob Ford is able to keep transport fares down, land transfer taxes, which is a big issue, if he can keep them down, the main beneficiaries are poor people who are living on the breadline. It can tip them. This is why I'm so opposed to Kathleen Wynne's dumb idea of hiking gasoline taxes, because you know who that affects? It doesn't affect me with my Lexus. It affects a single mother in Scarborough who's living on the breadline, or a small business. They can't afford these things. So Ford's appeal is based on an understanding by a segment of the electorate that with him in power, in spite of him smoking crack, using abusive language, associating probably with gangsters, which he does on his own dime as far as I can gather, the taxpayers don't pay for his vices, but the people benefit when the gravy train is stopped. And that's why I think there's a good chance he could be re-elected in his own right again.
Ray, I want to circle back to a point you're making, that phrase, intellectual fascism. Really interesting stuff there. You're talking about certain media approaches. But do you think that that mentality, is that indicative of a media culture, or is it indicative of another sort of culture out there, a middle class, a progressive?
Simple. When I ran Global for a long time, I never hired anyone from journalism schools, because if you go to the journalism schools, especially Ryerson and Cartoon University in the nation's capital, otherwise known as Carleton, the guys who teach journalism tend to be ultra left-wing rejects from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, where the culture of entitlement was invented. So check the list of names at Ryerson of the people who teach journalism. They teach them the wrong approach, which is intellectual elitism or fascism, which they gain from these alleged experts at journalism who are failures.
So let me try and square this with a parallel, because we hear in 1968 student radicals were out there being activists, and one of two things happened. They either cut the hair and went to the bank and got a corporate gig and went off and became taxpayers, or they got into the university system and they changed the minds and they changed the rules of the game. And it seems like what you're talking about is that's what's even happened in the media.
Basically, it's my generation. I really wasn't one of them. I didn't like the Vietnam War. You know, I covered it where it was lost in Washington. But the point is this, and many of them happen to be American draft dodgers who came to Canada to avoid fighting for their country. They got jobs in Canadian universities. And there are several names I won't mention on air because I don't want a libel action right now. I can't afford it. But they tend to be the journalism schools have perverted, and there's some notable examples of people who didn't do this. So I'm not blaming all J school professors. I'm saying as a class they tend to be ultra ideological, ultra anarcho-socialist, if not anarcho-Marxist, and that is a pity because the victims are the young people they teach at universities. And I know, or I knew very well, the heads of two of Canada's biggest universities, and we used to play tennis together, and they used to say, what can we do about this problem? They have tenure. You can't get rid of these idiots.
And I don't think we're going to be getting rid of this problem at all, Ray. Thanks so much. Interesting conversation. Yes. That was Sun News contributor Ray Hurd.